What happens to a dream deferred?
Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun?
Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat?
Or crust and sugar over like syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode?
Oh Lord, trouble so hard. Oh Lord.
Both sides of my family, my mother's family and my father's family, had been enslaved in Virginia in a county called Buckingham County. Our family story is very similar to other family stories because people who had been enslaved on a number of plantations decided not to leave, not to go to cities, not to go to towns, but to stay on those plantations and continue to work. And they kept their families together and stayed there for generations.
There is a new South, not through protests against the old, but because of new conditions, new adjustments, and if you please, new ideas and aspirations. We have sowed towns and cities in the place of theories and put business above politics.
Henry Grady is a newspaper person who supposedly coined the idea of the New South. A South that was more urban, a South that was more industrial, a South that was undergoing a process of modernization. Some historians argue that the old elite basically held on in power and its control over land and the labor force, and that the so-called New South looked a lot like the Old South.
Oh, come on, come on.
There is little difference between the antebellum South and the New South. Her white citizens are wedded to any method for the subjugation of the dark race.
My family became sharecroppers and tenant farmers. If we were to look back in time and to look at their lives, we would say they were very, very poor.
Sharecropping as a means of a livelihood was not a job description, I think, that most people would envy. It meant that you were on a kind of risk or a bet that at the end of the planting season you would have grown just enough to liquidate the debt that you had accumulated for your seeds, equipment, and your mule and the rest of it, and that you could then start afresh, laying some profit aside. It seldom worked that way. It turned out that the books were cooked and that the sharecropper was more deeply embedded year by year. By the 1900s, sharecropping is slavery by another name.
There really wasn't a whole lot of difference in terms of slavery and freedom economically. I think that the main difference was that people had control of themselves and control of their children. And so people didn't have to worry about being separated or sold. So freedom was significant, but not because they were able to gain economic advantages.
If you want to go to heaven.
The economic impoverishment of the sharecropping system left Black Americans in a weakened position to resist the emerging caste order. In the mid to late 1880s, Jim Crow laws mandating separate facilities started to show up on the books in southern states.
It's one of the paradoxes of the South that one race is responsible for the labor and the care and feeding, indeed, of many, many white people. And by 1900, there is an ideology that professes contamination if the races live, eat, heaven forbid, sleep, dine together. But of course, the point of it all was, once again, to maintain power on the part of those people who were developing this New South.
In 1896, Black activists organized to mount a legal challenge to segregation, but lost their case in the landmark Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson.
Plessy versus Ferguson declared that one could have racial democracy, but separately, that the races could go about their businesses separately, but equally.
Oh, in them long, hot summer days.
The Plessy decision affirmed the Jim Crow laws already on the books and opened the door for legal segregation to become institutionalized throughout the South. Its implications were long-term, far-reaching, and drove to the core of what it meant to be free.
That case is also very important in terms of the way it spoke to fitness for citizenship. Not whether or not you have, equal rights to sit on the streetcar, to take the streetcar, but your very fitness for citizenship.
If you look at white Southerners, the thing that makes them nuts is the right to vote. They do not accept the legitimacy of people who had been slaves now basically in a position of political citizenship. And it's something that they try mightily to go after as soon as they possibly can. They attempt to make registration more difficult, in some cases to impose poll taxes, to try to play not simply to the poverty of African American voters, but also to their illiteracy. By the early 20th century, the African American participation in the electoral process plummets to almost nothing.
Blood on the leaves and blood at the road. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze. Strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees.
The denial of economic opportunity, social access, and political redress was sustained by a systematic intimidation of African Americans.
Destruction of property was a primary way. The taking away of material resources of all sorts was a way. But certainly the threat of the loss of life was a persistent horror. Lynching is an old phenomenon. Before the Civil War, it wasn't used quite so much against African American people because they were considered to be property, and you didn't destroy your property. After the Civil War, then that property value was no longer in place.
You just didn't go to some places. You just didn't travel on some forms of transportation. You would never drink from a water fountain that white people drank from. You would step off the sidewalk if you were approached by a white person. My father, who was a very good man and a strong man, always called white men, no matter what their age, Mr. or Sir. And there was a whole collection of ways that people learned following